Welcome to our second season of Stratford Mail, a smart little history podcast from Stratford Hall Historic Preserve, where the voices of American history still speak. Find us online at stratfordmail.org and at stratfordhall.org. We're so glad you're back, and we hope you'll share Stratford Mail with a friend or colleague. Here now is our Director of Research, Dr. Gordon Blaine Steffi.
After a brief hiatus, we return to you with tales of dead Virginians and the bodies they left behind. The fact of death is so at odds with values we cherish that one might almost call death un-American. Progress, productivity, and persistence are some of those countervailing values. Science continues to work on solving the problem of death even as commercial industries profit from goods and services that promise to put the brakes on the processes that cause us to stop moving. Our antagonism to death is such that we insist that you die off stage, as it were, in the arid embrace of healthcare systems and facilities, ready to relinquish your mortal remains into the care of mortuary professionals who offer the bereaved a palette of options for the disposition of those remains, from a traditional coffin burial to having a bespoke vinyl recording pressed from your ashes. Death and dying in colonial Virginia weren't the contained, medicalized, and institutionalized phenomena they've become in our 21st century. Here in the northern neck of Virginia, death happened in plain view, typically at home, and the care and custody and final disposition of the corpse fell to the family, without the services of a death care industry. In consequence of the visibility and proximity of death, discussion of death and dead bodies was far more normal than exceptional among elite white Virginians of the colonial period. In January 1774, Philip Vickers Fithian, a Presbyterian clergyman and tutor to the family of Robert Carter III at Nomini Hall in the Northern Neck, wrote this in his journal.
After supper, Mr. Carter observed that he much dislikes the common method of making burying yards around churches and having them almost open to every beast. He would have them at some small distance from the church, neatly and strongly enclosed, and the graves kept up decent and plain. He told us he proposes to make his own coffin and use it for a chest till its proper use shall be required, that no stone nor inscription to be put over him, and that he would choose to be laid under a shady tree where he might be undisturbed and sleep in peace and obscurity. He told us that with his own hands he planted, and is with great diligence raising, a catalpa tree at the head of his father who lies in his garden. Mrs. Carter begged that she might have a stone with only this for a monument. Here lies Ann Tasker Carter. I left them about 10 and was hurried soon to bed. Not, however, without reflecting on the importance of our preparation for this great change.
Just over a month before Fithian's conversation with the Carters, a fellow tutor named John Lowe at nearby Bushfield Plantation, home of George Washington's younger brother Jack, that's John Augustine, complained to Fithian over the exposure of the church cemetery to animals.
At the church today, I heard an impious expression from a young Scotchman, tutor in Mr. Washington's family. He meant it for a satire upon the neglect of the people in suffering their graveyard to lie common. He saw some cattle and hogs feeding and rooting in the yard. Says he,
"Why, if I was buried here, it would grieve me to look up and see swine feeding over me."
But I understand only the lowest sort of people are buried at the church, for the gentlemen have private burying yards.
What's crystal clear from these entries is that Virginians had real and abiding concerns about the repose and integrity of dead bodies. And those concerns had their roots in the insecurities of the 17th century when the colony was new and unstable, and corpses were sometimes subject to various forms of desecration, whether non-burial or inadequate burial, and thus exposure to carrion eaters and omnivores like possums and hogs. Robert Carter contrasted the church graveyard, which is open to every beast, to the burial ground away from the church, neatly and strongly enclosed. John Lowe's comment to Fithian is satirical because, although it invokes the real insecurity of a graveyard open to rooting animals, swine here is in fact a reference to non-elites, which Fithian's remark, "the gentlemen have private burying yards," makes clear. While the practice of home burial responded to early traumas around the improper care of corpses, it also allowed elites to express their status. and to assert their difference in death as well as life from non-elites and non-whites. Deep inequalities around death and dying reinforced lived inequalities. Robert Carter III achieved in death his wish while living to rest in peace and obscurity. For while he is likely buried somewhere on the grounds of old Nomini, perhaps not terribly far from his father, precisely where is unknown. Stratford founder and acting governor of Virginia colony Thomas Lee died of apoplexy or hemorrhagic stroke on November 14, 1750. As news of Thomas' death crept across the colony, the Stratford household prepared to mourn him, foremost by attending to his body. Members of the household sat up with the corpse overnight. Now, the practice of sitting up with the dead had roots in old anxieties about not being present should the deceased awake, and about the bad things that happened to unattended corpses. Stratford women were in charge of Thomas' corpse, and washed, groomed, and dressed his body before laying it out. Thomas' eldest daughter, Hannah, was married and lived 20 miles away at Peckatone Plantation. His youngest daughter, Alice, was only just 14, and his wife, Hannah Harrison Ludwell, had preceded him in death by around 9 months. His body was therefore likely seen to by some combination of family, friends, neighbors, and paid workers. Without wallowing in graphic detail, this set of tasks included, for example, closing the deceased's eyes, weighting them with a coin if necessary, and closing their mouths by tying a string around the top of the head and jaw. The body thus prepared was then reposed, as if merely asleep, in a coffin crafted locally by a cabinet maker of black walnut, mahogany, or elm, and lined with materials as diverse as lead, velvet, Welsh cotton, and silk. Family and friends arrived to offer condolences to the bereaved and to bid farewell to Thomas, whose coffin, attended without pause by sitters, likely stood in the Stratford parlor or the Great Hall. Indentured and enslaved household staff offered refreshment to mourners, many of whom had traveled far. The refreshment was posh but not extravagant, in keeping with Thomas' preference.
Having observed much indecent mirth at funerals, I desire that last piece of human vanity be omitted, and that, attended only by some of those friends and relations that are near, my body may be silently interred with only the church ceremony, and that a funeral sermon for instruction to the living be preached at the parish church near Stratford on any other day.
The indecent mirth Thomas had in mind was associated with funeral feasting and the vast amounts of alcohol sometimes consumed. Funerals were opportunities for social interaction, and the strong emotions stirred by death and the renewing of relationships around it meant that funeral feasting sometimes got rowdy. Expenses for a 1774 funeral in the Shenandoah Valley included 3 gallons of wine and more than 19 gallons of liquor. Thomas wanted neither feasting nor funeral procession, but only for local family and friends to stand in silent witness, tossing some earth upon his coffin, as the local parson read from the Anglican order for the burial of the dead.
Forasmuch as it hath pleased Almighty God of his great mercy to take unto himself the soul of our dear brother Thomas, here departed, we therefore commit his body to the ground, earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust.
His funeral sermon, delivered at Pope's Creek Church perhaps several weeks after his burial, focused more on Christian moral instruction than on the specific comings and goings of Thomas Lee, except to the extent that he could be lauded as a model Christian. In his will, Thomas left his sons and daughters mourning rings to remember him, and handed down mourning rings he'd received on the death of his friends. By the time of Thomas' death, these gold rings were often enameled in black with gold lettering naming the deceased, his age, and the death date. None have survived. As to the body, 3 days between death and interment were traditional for early modern Anglicans. It may have stood slightly longer in temperate November so as to allow for more far-flung relations to arrive. But sadly, his 3 eldest sons, Philip, Thomas, and Richard Henry, were abroad in England for study. On the 3rd day, traditionally, the body would have been removed from Stratford and transported by some sort of wheeled conveyance to the burial site, and there interred according to the wishes of the deceased.
As to my body, I desire, if it pleases God that I die anywhere in Virginia, I may be buried between my late dearest wife and my honoured mother, and that the bricks on the side next my wife may be moved, and my coffin placed as near hers as is possible, without moving it or disturbing the remains of my mother.
His executors would have known precisely where he meant to be buried. He did not mean at Stratford. A mid-19th century source, Bishop William Meade, wrongly inferred that Thomas was buried at Pope's Creek Church, newly built in 1744 and only about 5 miles from Stratford. Now, why did Meade think so? Meade read Lee's grave ledger, a 5 or 6 inch thick slab of stone, often marble, measuring about 30 by 72 inches and incised in English with genealogical and memorial information. Grave ledgers were laid atop the grave of the deceased, but when Meade read Thomas' ledger, it was lying unlaid at Stratford. The ledger, cut and incised in England soon after Thomas' death, perhaps in 1751, shipped across the Atlantic at an expense at least equal to the ledger itself, was landed at Stratford where it languished unlaid for around 170 years. A single line from the ledger's epitaph led Meade astray. Referring to Thomas and his wife Hannah, that line was,
"Their monument is erected in the lower church of Washington Parish, in this county, 5 miles above their country seat, Stratford Hall."
Though the lower church, Pope's Creek, and the monument placed there have long since vanished, Revolution VIP and Stratford-reared Richard Henry Lee recorded the text of the monument placed in Pope's Creek Church in honor of his parents. After hailing Thomas and Hannah as excellent parents and patterns of conjugal virtue, the monument read,
"They are buried 18 miles from this, in the family burying place called the Old..."
And the manuscript is frustratingly torn here. So we leap across centuries now to November 8th, 1922, when 8 members of the newly formed Society of the Lees of Virginia transported that 600-pound tomb ledger, sitting at Stratford, to its current site about 18 miles as the crow flies from Pope's Creek to a then overgrown, ruined cemetery near Lower Machotic Creek. This was the site of Machotic, the plantation of Thomas Lee's father Richard, and home to Thomas and Hannah until local miscreants looted it and burned it to the ground in January 1729. The Machotic fire prompted Thomas to redevelop property he had acquired in 1716 as Stratford, and forever lent the name Old Burnt House Fields to the site of the 1729 arson. By 1922, only a single black marble grave ledger remained among the ruined brick walls and overgrowth of the cemetery there at Machotic. It was the ledger of Thomas' father Richard and mother Letitia, or Lettuce. Here then is where Thomas wished to lie in eternal repose, between his mother Letitia and his wife Hannah. Now, just beneath the surface of the ground sat a brick crypt modified in accordance with Thomas' wish for his coffin to lie as close as possible to Hannah. Placed atop the vault, his ledger has greeted visitors to that remote place for more than 100 years. Better late than never. Virginia gentry rarely used memento mori imagery on their tombs and monuments. Memento mori is a Latin expression translated remember death, and associated artistically with skulls, wilting flowers, coffins, and hourglasses. An exception to this rule is Robert King Carter's imposing tomb on the grounds of historic Christ Church in Weems, Virginia, which boasts a prominent skull and crossbones. Virginia gentry tended more often to quote, if you will, architectural elements of their plantation houses in their tombs. The subterranean brick vault of Thomas and Hannah Lee at Burnt House Fields draws a conceptual line back to the bricks of Stratford, the site of Lee power and influence. And it cements dynastic lines with the Lees who built Machotic, Dividing Creek, and other great houses of the Tidewater. Though it sits at Burnt House Fields, Thomas' grave ledger points elsewhere, its last 2 words stating precisely where, Stratford Hall in capitals and italics. It's been argued that home burial in tombs that refer to the homes in which the deceased lived and where their descendants dwelt still asserted continuity even in the face of death and its many ruptures. Elite family cemeteries became rooms of the big house, as it were, outbuildings that reiterated the uninterrupted power of the family and stood in brutal contrast to the burying grounds of the enslaved. Mourning jewelry, like the rings Thomas handed down, his own and others, weren't material mementos of human mortality, but rather expressions of continuity of control with the deceased and his social networks. Expressions of dynastic permanence rather than individual ephemerality, best suited the precarious situation of Virginia gentry. The burial vault at Stratford Hall, completed under the management of Henry Lighthorse Harry Lee III, nephew of Thomas Lee, is empty. But it hasn't always been. And that's a story for another day. From Stratford Hall in Westmoreland County, Virginia, I'm Director of Research, Dr. Gordon Blaine Steffi.
Dear listeners, wouldn't you like to do more than just listen? Become an active participant with Stratford Hall in the production of new and exciting programmes like Stratford Mail. Sponsor an episode or more of Stratford Mail by getting in touch with us at www.stratfordhall.org/support-Stratford, and please don't forget to follow Stratford Mail and share it with someone you love, someone you know. They'll be so happy you did.